Um, just back to Codex Wallerstein. I mean, there is also a very nice picture where a knight is standing holding his belt, and there are different pieces of types of arms around.
Yes.
What is this? What does that mean?
So this is the title page, and the title page, the text in the title page actually is the bit that tells us 1459. It says in 1459 Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch, and then the other text says überkommen im 1556 Jahr am 26. January Paulus Hector Meyer zugehörig. So came into Paulus Hector Meyer's collection on the 26th of January 1556, and that image shows a full retinue of weapons. So what we see is we see a glaive, a spear. So there's a glaive on the, I'll just pull the image up. There's a glaive on the left-hand side with a very pronounced back spike. On the right-hand side, we have a spear, and then just inside of that, poleaxe. Then we have a pair of swords crossing over the shoulders, a pair of daggers rising up at the waist, and at the feet we have a messer on the left-hand side and a sword and buckler on the right, and the buckler has a great big spike in the front of it as well. And so this is fairly consistent with what Lichtenauer himself in his Zettel says you should handle manfully, as glaive, spear, messer, sword, and dagger. That you should. This is the retinue really that one should know, that one should be familiar with, and so that's an interesting a comparison, because as we know, this isn't a Lichtenauer source. So there's yes, that is pretty much what we should be aiming to practice in arms. Yeah, it's quite a lot.
You mentioned also Baumann, right? As a person, right?
Yes.
So who was that?
So Vonn Baumann, there is a record of a Michael Baumann, curiously, who's listed as a mercenary, living in Augsburg. It's recorded in the tax ledgers of Augsburg, and he was living in Augsburg between 1471 and 1495, which is really interesting, because if we think of the latter part of the latest dated section of this manuscript is believed to be no later than 1470. There's perhaps more reason that we should be calling this Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch, because it was possibly his. And if it is, or again, if we can make that connection, which would be difficult at this point, but if we could make that connection, then what I've said about it being the manuscript being geared specifically to somebody who's a professional fighting man of a non-aristocratic background, then Vonn Baumann would fit the bill perfectly. The section, the front matter where it reads the words, if I just find them again, come on, the front matter where it reads 1459 Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch, 1549 Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch, and then came into the possession of Paulus Hector Meyer 1556. Well, if Vonn Baumann's living in Augsburg between, from the 1470s onwards through the 1490s, as the tax records show, then the 1459 date in the front matter that reads 1459, then the words Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch, the 1459 couldn't be connected to Vonn Baumann. He would be bloody old if he was still alive at that point. So could it have been passed down to one of Vonn Baumann's descendants? It's possible. But again, we don't know whether this was recorded in the front as just being a note to say this is that the date that message was written was 1549, and the message simply is that this was Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch. But he's certainly a character I'd like to learn a little bit more about, because I tend to like my 15th century German mercenaries. They provide the most colour. Good old Hans. So if we can find out anything more about Michael Baumann, this would be interesting. It's interesting that they use as it's recorded as Vom, VOM, rather than Von, because again, as we know in German culture, the prefix Von is a noble prefix. To distinguish that that's somebody who's notable from a certain place, whereas lower class people would generally be referred to with a non-patronymic surname, for example, Hans Stettner, somebody from Stetten in Germany, or even we know Johannes Lichtnauer is not von Lichtnauer. So again, it denotes that these people are of a lower social order. The fact that it's recorded as Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch is interesting, but I think there's work to be done there, and it would certainly be fascinating to find out anything more about it.
Of course, the Vonn is an aristocratic title, and so another question. You mentioned also Paulus Hector Meyer. He ended up as a thief to finance his hobby, right?
He's a subject matter all in his own right, because Paulus Hector Meyer is a fascinating character. He was a civil servant who had I consider myself to be obsessed with fencing to an unhealthy degree. Probably only second to my obsession for huskies, but Paulus Hector Meyer is so far down the path of needing to know, of having to collate and collect, that he's stealing money from the city treasuries, and eventually it's found out and he's hanged for it. Probably a subject for another chat. But Paulus Hector Meyer, though, left us with one of the absolute high points in fencing literature of the 16th century, because again, his work is a compendia. We don't even know for certain whether Paulus Hector Meyer was active as a fencer, or even, somebody who attended the Fechtschule. I would expect he did. You normally can't. One goes hand in hand with the other, but he's a fascinating character, and he embezzled city funds until the point he was spending so much money he was discovered, and they had to get rid of him.
Okay, so of course we can talk about him later, but he doesn't have any manuscript attributed to him that he wrote it himself, right? We don't know that.
Well, Paulus Hector Meyer's produced a monumental work in the middle of the 16th century, and it's a compendia, which was brand new, illustrated, and records an awful lot of fencing material.
He was not only a collector. He also produced himself. Did I understand you correctly?
He did produce a manuscript, yes. But this manuscript is a collection from other sources. He wasn't a master of fencing who produced a methodology of his own.
That's what I meant. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But nevertheless, a fascinating character. I mean, again, just a little bit of background about him. I'm just looking here. Again, he's out of my period generally, but it says here he's usually likely received training in fencing and grappling from the masters of Augsburg Fencing Guild. So, but he had a fixation with fencing to the point that he would collect voraciously, and his manuscript, a number of manuscripts, the Dresden manuscript produced in the 1540s, which is the catalogue number C93, C94. Another one in the 1540s is Codex 393, and a further one, Codex 10825 and 10826. So, yes, in fact, there's a full list of them here that I've got. So, compilations of 2 treatises from the Nuremberg group of fencing, and an older uncaptioned series of fencing drawings known as the pseudo gladiatorial. So he's pulling together all sorts of stuff at that point in time, getting into a lot of trouble for it and paying for it with his life.
Of course, it's always collecting things always becomes an obsession, right?
Yeah, it can be tricky.
Just one more question regarding the Codex Wallerstein. There are different copies of it, right? Original copies of it.
So this one in particular, there is only one. There are other manuscripts that share similarities, but this one is unique. There's only the one entry, the one catalog entry. The Wallerstein name itself is the collection that it originally belonged to, which was the Oettingen-Wallerstein collection, which was subsumed by the Augsburg Library, and so these books all came in. There's 7 fencing manuscripts, I believe, from the Wallerstein Oettingen collection that came into the Augsburg collection, and this was one of them. So theoretically, there are 7 books which we could call Codex Wallerstein, but only one Vonn Baumanns Fechtbuch that is the one we've been talking about.
And are illustrations also colored? Some of the illustrations?
Yes, these ones are colored. There's one thing I would say about this manuscript is that while it's full of absolutely fascinating material, and it's such a thought-provoking manuscript, it's not of the highest quality. Certainly the section from the 1470s, the people or the fencers or the fighters depicted are particularly ugly. They're not very pleasant to look at. This color, it's been rudimentary. There's been rudimentary coloring there in in various shades of sort of orange and green. It's not nice to look at particularly, but other than that, the illustrations only go so far. It's really the illustrations are incredibly useful, but the book itself, the way the book is laid out and what it shows is fascinating.
Bob, why don't I see many HEMA practitioners and instructors who refer to this Codex Wallerstein? You just hear always others.
There was a bit of interest in it in the early 2000s. Certainly, Gregor Zabinski was instrumental in bringing this largely to the attention of medievalists. And Gregor Zabinski did some incredible work. In fact, I would say the work still to this day on the Kunst des Messerfechtens, together with Russ Mitchell and Falco Fritz. I think one of the reasons why this gets left behind is because it's quite loose on instruction. There's not a lot of ground. There's not a lot of fundamental principle groundwork in here. They do talk. There is, there's some information or some advice given on understanding length and measure, strong and weak, vor und nach, the phases of combat. But it's not as clear, for example, as say the manuscript attributed to Peter von Danzig, 1452, which is just block upon block of text with specific instructions of how to do this, how to do that. I always think it's overshadowed by these larger, more complete manuscripts, because it's not as accessible. And I think that to somebody who's got a good degree of familiarity with medieval German fencing methodology as a baseline, which is certainly where I came to it from, then the Wallerstein material offers an awful lot of extra material. It's almost like the bonus CD. You get all this extra material, but it's fascinating when there's several ways we could look at learning this. We could learn it all and pull it all into our free fencing and our competitive play. But for me, what was fascinating was putting Wallerstein's material in a context that it originated in, and so we can talk about knightly combat and wearing full harness and adopting certain, doing certain things according to certain manuscripts. My desire, as it is with everything, is to understand it at a deeper level, and to understand not just what it is and how it works, but why is it the way it is? Why is it written like this? Why is it presented like this? And then again, as I said, that led me down the route to think that this is something that's either been recorded as a series of fight mechanics for a professional fighter of non-aristocratic origin, is to understand and to understand, its place amongst everything else. Because we have fighting for peasants. We've got Messer sources galore, sword and buckler sources galore. We have fighting for the aristocrats. We have all the armored fighting, the horseback, all of the material. This seems to fit a more of a middle ground, along with Hans Talhofer, and there's a strong connection between the sources that emerge in the mid to late 15th century from kind of that south central part of Germany, from the sort of Munich, Augsburg, over towards, as you get into sort of down to the Bavaria and Thuringia, Swabia. There's a very strong culture that exists that we see repeated over and over again. We see the same plays, we see the same approaches. Sometimes we even see the same orders in which plays appear. So I would imagine that if anybody's involved in the art of professional warfare, they're going to meet other people who are involved in the art of professional warfare. And there's going to be this glorious melange of ideas that people share and cross paths with at the tavern or on campaign. They bump into and eventually when it gets written down, these are just distillations of a human experience. We can't really look at them in the same way as we look at an instructional manual today. Is that these are often just distillations of human experience recorded, either for posterity or as a means to remembering or as a means to passing on knowledge. But they're fascinating release. But this is one of my favorite manuscripts for a variety of reasons. And again, when we look at the technicality of some of the plays, just how fundamentally they understood fight principles of leverage, geometry, position, strong, weak. The knowledge level there is sublime. They have a phenomenal understanding of combat, far in excess of what we would ever initially have given them credit for. And again, this has been a big part of my own research, is to understand the thought process, because these are all what we're seeing is we're seeing almost like a snapshot of a process of thought processes in somebody's life, or a series of lives that have led up to the recording of this particular technique. But within that, we see embedded all of this knowledge, all of this science, because it's a word that we often disregard with medieval art or medieval, with medieval culture generally. Science is that an understanding of physical sciences, and some very abstract concepts as well. But the physical sciences, the understanding of how to affect leverage best, how to defend yourself and optimize that defense while facing potentially deadly threat. And these people were so far beyond, I think, what we would ever have given them credit for 20 or 30 years ago, when the idea of medieval combat was people smashing each other with maces. And, you know, it's so much more than that. And they're worthy of so much more research and so much more praise.
Thank you very much, Bob. Would you like to add something to Codex Wallerstein?
It is one of the holy trinity of Mesa sources that I am using for my forthcoming Mesa book. Had a little bit of a hiatus on that, but it is getting there. I'm sadly a serial perfectionist, and when it comes to actually releasing this book, I want it to be right. Not right as in this is the right way to do it, but right that I know this is, you know, this is what I want. But Wallerstein forms a very substantial part of what I would consider a good corpus of sources to teach the fundamental Mesa art, not the refined Mesa art that we see from Lekushna onwards, but the early Mesa, the peasant Mesa, the folk culture. And so I've combined Wallerstein, the lessons the players that are contained in Wallerstein have formed part of the progression of lessons for teaching Mesa to anybody, and that together with the Glasgow Fechtbuch and Paulus Cal, because again they're all contemporaneous and they're all from the same tradition, certainly the same social construct that produced this widespread methodology of fighting with Mesa. So it's been a very, very useful manuscript for me in terms of teaching something that's never or wasn't laid out. There's no Mesa methodology at all prior to Lekushna. It's simply just a series of scattered sources, often showing the same things, often showing variations of certain things. But Wallerstein's allowed me to be able to bring this into some kind of order so that it can be taught sequentially, and it can be taught in a way that you begin with the simple things, which is fighting at measure, fighting outside of fighting at Mesa measure, and then working in, because martial arts really, teach weapon martial arts work from the outside in. A fight starts here and eventually ends up here. And so that's the methodology I've applied to this. But Wallerstein has formed a very central part of that, because the Mesa work is very effective.
Well, thank you very much, Bob, for all this detailed information you provided us with.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. And we are going to have you back on our channel soon, hopefully.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I wish you a nice day, Bob.